Walk into any major American supermarket today, and your brain receives a carefully engineered signal: everything is fine. The fluorescent lights hum at a reassuring frequency, the floors are waxed to a mirror shine, and the shelves appear mathematically packed. But if you look past the bright packaging, you are actually standing in the middle of a massive, slow-motion magic trick. The grocery store of 2026 is an illusion of abundance designed to mask a quiet, systemic retreat: 12 specific staple foods. Items that millions of American families consider foundational to their weekly meals are being quietly phased out, rationed behind the scenes or outright pulled from distribution. They won't be back in their original form or at their historical price points until 2027 at the absolute earliest. Some of them are sitting in your pantry right now, but you won't see empty shelves. Modern retail logistics has perfected a practice known as facing, pulling the remaining inventory to the front of the shelf and spreading it out to create the visual profile of a fully stocked aisle. Behind that single row of boxes is nothing but empty space and dust. One brand at a time, one minor recipe reformulation at a time, the products we rely on are vanishing. By the time the average shopper notices that their favorite brand of imported Italian pasta or pure cocoa has been replaced by a generic, highly processed substitute from a different continent, the window to do anything about it will have already closed. The scale of what is happening right now is unprecedented, yet completely silent. We are not facing a sudden, dramatic collapse where people fight over the last loaf of bread. Instead, we are experiencing a slow, calculated recalibration of the American diet. It is a crisis of subtraction. The beef herd in this country has dwindled to a level not seen since Harry Truman was in the White House. 95% of American dairy farms have quietly gone out of business over the last 50 years, leaving our milk and butter supply precariously dependent on a hyper-consolidated handful of industrial mega-facilities. Global supply lines for pantry essentials like olive oil and canned tuna are snapping under the weight of climate instability, trade wars, and soaring logistics costs. This is not a temporary blip. The systems that put food on our tables are hitting hard biological and geopolitical walls. You cannot speed up the 3-year growth cycle of a coffee tree, nor can you force a depleted cattle herd to regenerate overnight. The rules of the grocery game have changed, and the industry's response is not to solve the underlying ecological or economic crises, but to manage your perception of them. They do this through shrinkflation, quiet substitutions, and the strategic elimination of slower-moving, high-quality varieties in favor of cheap, high-margin alternatives. The scary part isn't just that these 12 foods are disappearing. The scary part is that the mechanism of their disappearance is designed to keep you calm, compliant, and spending more money for a weekly basket of goods that is physically shrinking. Your grocery budget is being cannibalized by a series of quiet corporate triage decisions that happen in boardrooms thousands of miles away from your local store. In this investigation, we are going to tear down the illusion of the supermarket shelf. We will expose the hidden crises stripping these 12 specific essentials from your store, explain the raw math of why they cannot return anytime soon, and reveal the one terrifying biological bottleneck in our food system that is about to make a basic baking staple almost impossible to find by the end of this year. If you think your grocery budget is tight now, you need to understand exactly what is about to vanish from the grid, because once these items are gone, the cost of feeding your family will never look the same again. To understand how the supermarket shelves became an optical illusion, you have to trace the structural collapse back to a series of catastrophic policy decisions and geographic realities. The crisis of the American food supply did not begin with recent inflation, nor did it begin with post-pandemic shipping bottlenecks. It began decades ago when we traded resilience for raw efficiency, constructing a food system that functions perfectly only under absolutely flawless conditions. Now, those conditions are gone, and the geographic and historical traps we built for ourselves are snapping shut. The most glaring example of this is the American beef industry, which has quietly retreated to its smallest herd size since 1951. This is not a random fluctuation in a standard business cycle. It is the direct consequence of a century-old geographic trap. In 1922, 7 western states signed the Colorado River Compact, an agreement that divided up the river's water based on data from one of the wettest periods in the region's history. It was a mathematical lie from the start. For decades, cattle ranchers relied on this artificially cheap, over-allocated water to irrigate massive pastures in arid western basins. But as a decades-long megadrought gripped the American West, the water dried up and the soil turned to dust. Ranchers were forced to make a brutal financial calculation. Without natural grass, they had to buy commercial feed, primarily corn and soybeans. But the price of grain has skyrocketed due to federal biofuel mandates that divert millions of acres of farmland away from food production to produce ethanol. When feed costs consume up to 60% of a ranch's total operating budget, the math simply stops working. Between 2020 and 2025, ranchers across Texas, Kansas, and Nebraska liquidated millions of mother cows simply because they could not afford to keep them alive. The industry didn't just shrink, it hollowed out its own future capacity. In biology, you cannot bypass time. A heifer takes 2 years to reach breeding age, and her calf takes another 18 months to reach market weight. We are locked into a multi-year supply deficit that no amount of retail cleverness can hide. This pattern of hyper-efficiency leading to extreme vulnerability is even more pronounced in the dairy industry. In 1970, more than 640,000 dairy farms operated across the United States, providing a decentralized, resilient network of milk and butter production. Today, that number has plummeted by 95%, leaving roughly 24,000 operational farms. This was not an accident. It was the deliberate result of the 1970s USDA policy shift led by Secretary Earl Butz, whose famous ultimatum to American farmers was to get big or get out. The small family dairy was systematically starved of credit and regulatory support, replaced by massive, highly automated industrial dairies holding tens of thousands of cows each. On paper, this consolidation made milk incredibly cheap to produce. In reality, it created a fragile, centralized system where a single point of failure can disrupt the entire nation's supply. When input costs like diesel, veterinary medicine, and specialized feed mixes spike, these massive operations face millions of dollars in monthly overhead. If a mega dairy goes bankrupt, it doesn't just reduce supply, it wipes out entire regional distribution networks. The physical infrastructure is sold off, the land is paved over for suburban housing, and the cows are sent to slaughter. That productive capacity is gone forever. This explains why butter has become a volatile luxury item. It takes 21 pounds of raw milk to produce just 1 single pound of butter. In a consolidated market where industrial dairies must allocate a limited milk supply among fluid milk, cheese, yogurt, and butter, the lowest margin product gets cut first, while domestic agriculture collapses under domestic policy failures. Our reliance on foreign processing has set another trap. Consider canned tuna, a pantry staple that millions of lower-income families use as their primary source of affordable, shelf-stable protein. The United States has thousands of miles of coastline and some of the world's richest marine territories. Yet we import 59% of our canned tuna from processing facilities in Thailand and Vietnam. This geographic separation of harvesting and processing is a direct product of the globalization rush of the late 20th century. In the 1980s and 1990s, American canning operations in places like San Pedro, California, shut down because they could not compete with the low wages of Southeast Asian factories. As a result, a fish caught in the Pacific Ocean must now travel thousands of miles to a processing facility in Bangkok, only to be shipped thousands of miles back to a distribution center in Ohio. This model assumes that global shipping will always remain cheap and unobstructed. But with fuel costs rising, major shipping lanes plagued by geopolitical conflicts, and labor disputes stalling American ports, the physical cost of moving these cans has eclipsed the value of the food inside them. The product on the shelf is no longer a cheap source of protein, it is a highly taxed logistics commodity. The final element of this geographic trap is the illusion of the organic label, particularly in poultry and egg production. When avian influenza struck, it decimated over 100 million birds across the United States. Conventional producers, operating with massive financial backing, could rapidly restock their facilities. But for organic egg and chicken producers, the recovery timeline is a regulatory bottleneck. Under USDA rules, an organic laying hen must be raised on certified organic land and fed certified organic feed from its second day of life. Because the supply of certified organic feed grain is incredibly small and highly dependent on imports from South America and India, organic poultry producers cannot simply buy feed on the open market. They are trapped by a rigid regulatory structure that makes rapid recovery impossible. The organic section of the grocery store is not empty because of a lack of consumer interest. It is empty because the specialized, delicate supply chain required to produce it cannot withstand a major biological shock. We built a food system that prioritized low costs and high volume above all else, and we are now paying the true price of that design. The quiet disappearance of these foods is not a passive byproduct of bad luck. It is an active war of attrition fought over razor-thin margins. Behind the peaceful ambient noise of your local supermarket, corporate buyers, federal trade lawyers, and industrial lobbyists are locked in a ruthless struggle. What you see on the shelves is not what is actually happening in the supply chain. It is simply what survived the slaughter. Nowhere is this clash of forces more visible than in the pasta aisle, which became a literal economic battleground. The conflict erupted when domestic manufacturing giants, specifically massive U.S. pasta producers Winland Foods and 8th Avenue Food and Provisions, petitioned the U.S. Department of Commerce to intervene. They claimed that premium Italian brands were dumping their products, selling authentic durum wheat semolina pasta in the United States at prices lower than their production costs. In late 2025, the federal government responded with a proposed staggering 91.74% anti-dumping tariff on 13 of the largest Italian exporters, including household favorites like Garofalo and La Molisana. When combined with existing horizontal duties, some importers faced a trade barrier exceeding 100%. Time Show 1. The corporate logic behind this protectionist maneuver was simple: price out the high-quality European imports so American consumers would be forced to buy cheaper domestic alternatives. For the consumer, the consequences of this regulatory warfare is immediate and severe. Importers cannot absorb a 100% cost increase, and retailers refuse to shrink their margins. Instead of paying $4 for a box of premium bronze dye extruded rigatoni, shoppers are suddenly asked to pay $8. Retail buyers reacted by quietly dropping these specialty lines altogether. They filled the empty space on the shelves by spreading out boxes of low-protein, mass-produced domestic pasta. The shelf looks just as full, but the authentic product you bought for 20 years has been priced out of existence, replaced by a lower-quality substitute that turns to mush if boiled a minute too long. Meanwhile, a quiet ecological retreat is playing out at the seafood counter, where wild-caught salmon is being systematically erased. In Alaska's pristine waters, which supply the bulk of America's wild-caught catch, the biological reality of the oceans has run headfirst into corporate extraction. Several critical river systems have seen salmon runs collapse to historic lows, forcing the Alaska Department of Fish and Game to issue emergency closures and drastically shorten commercial fishing seasons. But the grocery chains cannot afford to show empty ice displays. They need to maintain the visual promise of fresh seafood. The industry's solution is a masterclass in quiet substitution. More than 70% of the salmon sold in the US today is now farm-raised in open-water net pens in Chile, Canada, or Norway. These industrial fish farms are highly controversial, plagued by sea lice infestations and heavy antibiotic use, but they provide a predictable, manufactured supply. Because federal labeling laws allow for creative marketing, farmed salmon is routinely displayed under ambiguous labels like Atlantic salmon, which sounds like a wild origin to the untrained shopper. True wild sockeye and king salmon have shifted from a standard dinner option to a hyper-luxury commodity, sold at prices that are completely unviable for the average household. The seafood counter didn't run out of fish, it just replaced a wild, natural resource with a highly managed, industrialized imitation. The exact same pattern of biological failure is hollowing out the coffee aisle. Driven by an ecological crisis in the coffee belt, Brazil, which grows a third of the world's coffee, has faced back-to-back years of catastrophic weather. Severe droughts followed by unprecedented frosts decimated millions of fragile Arabica coffee trees. In agriculture, Coffee is uniquely vulnerable because of a hard biological bottleneck. When a farmer plants a replacement coffee seedling, it takes 3 to 5 years of growth before that tree yields its first commercial harvest. The global market is currently staring down a multi-year supply gap that cannot be bridged by technology or money. LSE blogs faced with a massive shortage of premium Arabica beans, major coffee brands had to make a choice. Let the shelves go bare or change what is inside the bag. They chose the latter. Specialty roasters are quietly reformulating their signature blends by mixing in cheaper, bitter Robusta beans, which are easier to grow and more resilient to harsh weather. To hide the drop in quality, they roast the beans darker, using heavy, smoky flavor profiles to mask the inferior raw ingredients. Simultaneously, they deployed the classic trick of shrinkflation. The standard 12-ounce bag of whole bean coffee is being phased out, replaced by a 10-ounce bag sold at the exact same price, or even higher. The consumer goes home with less coffee of a lower grade, paying more for the privilege, while the grocery store maintains the illusion of an uninterrupted premium coffee selection. The final element of this quiet crisis is the slow collapse of the organic poultry sector, a market that represents just 1% of total US chicken production. This tiny specialized industry is being crushed by a brutal combination of high regulatory hurdles and corporate consolidation. To label chicken as organic, the birds must have outdoor access and be fed certified organic, non-GMO grains. But the market for organic feed is dominated by a tiny handful of agricultural conglomerates. When international shipping rates spiked and droughts struck grain-producing regions in South America, the cost of organic feed skyrocketed. While conventional poultry giants can leverage their massive scale to absorb these cost shocks, independent organic farmers are operating on a financial knife edge. Many have been forced to abandon their organic certifications, reverting to conventional farming methods just to survive. The major supermarket chains, prioritizing reliable volume over niche labels, have responded by consolidating their organic poultry contracts. They are dropping smaller, local organic farms and replacing them with a single, massive, corporate private label supplier. The organic chicken breast you buy today is highly likely to come from the exact same industrial processing plant as the conventional chicken on the next shelf, just wrapped in a different plastic tray with a green sticker and a 30% markup. The independent, high-standard organic farm did not survive the squeeze, and neither did the integrity of the product.